The desert was a furnace of swirling sand and choking heat, a place where even hope felt like it had been burned away by the relentless sun, and the squad crouched low behind a crumbling ridge of rock, weapons clutched tight in trembling hands as gunfire ripped across the barren expanse. The air was alive with the whistle of bullets and the dull thuds of mortars pounding the ground, sending up plumes of dust that mixed with the howling wind to create a blinding haze. Their convoy had been ambushed hours ago, leaving half their vehicles smoldering wrecks and several men dead before they even had a chance to react. And now what remained of their unit was huddled in a shallow depression carved out by years of erosion, trying to survive while an unseen enemy closed in from all directions. The colonel stood at the center of the chaos, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar cutting across his cheek and a voice that could carry through even the roar of explosions, barking orders into the static-filled radio clutched in his gloved hand, his face grim and streaked with dirt as he tried to raise command for support. "No response," he finally muttered, tossing the useless radio onto the sand with a sharp curse, and the soldiers around him exchanged nervous glances, the reality of their situation settling in like a lead weight in their stomachs. "Sir, air support?" one of the privates asked, his voice shaking as he reloaded his rifle with trembling fingers, and the colonel turned his piercing gaze toward the young man, his jaw tight. "No help is coming," he said firmly, his words carrying the weight of certainty, and for a moment, the only sound was the staccato rattle of distant gunfire and the mournful wail of the wind. They had been sent deep into hostile territory on a mission that was supposed to be simple, secure an outpost that had gone dark after reporting suspicious enemy movement, but nothing about it had been simple from the start. Their convoy had traveled through endless miles of barren terrain, a sea of jagged rocks and rolling dunes where every shadow looked like a sniper's nest, and when the first rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the lead Humvee, everything had descended into chaos. Men had scrambled for cover, shouting over the deafening roar of gunfire, but the attackers had been prepared, striking with surgical precision, forcing them off the road and into this forsaken stretch of desert where visibility was almost non-existent and the enemy had the advantage. Now they were pinned, low on ammunition and surrounded, and every passing second brought the sound of enemy fighters creeping closer, their silhouettes darting like ghosts through the shifting haze of sand. The squad had taken up defensive positions around what was left of their vehicles, sandbags hastily piled up for cover, and every man knew they were one lucky mortar away from being blown apart. Sweat ran down their faces despite the bitter wind, and the smell of gunpowder and burning fuel clung to their nostrils like a reminder that death was only a heartbeat away. The colonel crouched beside the driver's side of an overturned Humvee, his rifle resting across his knees, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. He was a man hardened by years of combat, his presence a steady anchor for the younger soldiers whose nerves were fraying under the relentless pressure. "Stay low," he barked as a volley of bullets kicked up sand just feet away, forcing a corporal to duck back behind cover, his face pale and slick with fear. "Don't waste ammo. Make every shot count." His voice was calm but firm, carrying authority that kept the men focused even as panic scratched at the edges of their minds. The sandstorm that had been building all day had now fully descended, reducing visibility to mere yards, and in that swirling chaos, the enemy moved like shadows, firing from unseen positions before melting back into the dust. The squad responded with controlled bursts, their rifles cracking through the thick air, but the enemy was relentless, testing their defenses, probing for weakness, and every time a man shifted from cover to fire, bullets screamed past him with deadly precision. Corporal Ramirez, his face streaked with grime and blood from a shallow cut above his eyebrow, crawled over to the colonel, clutching the squad's remaining supply of ammunition in a dented metal box. "We're almost dry, sir," he said grimly, opening the lid to reveal only a few half-empty magazines rattling inside. The colonel's eyes flicked to the box and he nodded once, expression unreadable. "Ration it. Make it last," he said quietly, then leaned out just far enough to send a burst of fire at a flicker of movement in the distance, the recoil kicking against his shoulder as he ducked back behind cover. The crack of a sniper round split the air, and a soldier just feet away cried out, slumping forward with a strangled gasp as blood stained the sand beneath him. Another man dragged him back behind cover, hands pressed to the wound, but the colonel's face didn't flinch. He'd seen too many men fall to let it shake him now. "We hold this position," he said, voice carrying above the storm, and the men around him nodded grimly, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. The enemy was close now, too close, and every instinct told him they were being herded, pushed into a kill zone where escape would be impossible. He glanced at the broken radio lying in the sand, its cracked screen flashing weakly, and a bitter thought crossed his mind. They were on their own, cut off from command, stranded in enemy territory with no reinforcements coming. "We'll fight to the last," he muttered under his breath, adjusting his rifle and scanning the swirling storm for movement. Another rocket slammed into the ground nearby, the shockwave knocking several men off their feet, and shouts filled the air as they scrambled back into position. The world had narrowed to the confines of this shattered patch of desert, a crucible of fire and dust where survival hinged on sheer grit and determination, and the colonel knew the only way out was through. He raised his rifle again, fired at a flash of muzzle fire in the distance, and barked orders with the calm precision of a man who had stared death in the face too many times to be rattled now. Around him, the squad held their ground, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, their fingers tight on their triggers, waiting for the next wave to descend. And somewhere beyond the wall of sand and smoke, the enemy prepared to strike again, their shadows moving closer, unseen but felt, like wolves circling wounded prey. The storm thickened until the world was nothing but a shifting wall of dust and chaos, the air tasting of grit and gunpowder, every breath scraping down their throats like sandpaper as the colonel crawled along the line of battered soldiers, checking their positions with an unflinching calm that steadied their trembling hands. They were ghosts in a hellscape now, their faces hidden beneath goggles and scarves crusted with dirt, their hearts pounding in their ears louder than the crack of gunfire. The enemy had gone silent for a moment, their movements hidden, and that silence was worse than the shooting because every man knew it meant something was coming, something bigger than the relentless skirmishing they'd endured for hours. Corporal Ramirez glanced at the colonel as he crawled up beside him, his eyes wide behind his goggles, and whispered, "They're regrouping, sir. They're going to hit us hard." The colonel didn't answer right away, scanning the horizon with slow, practiced precision, searching for any sign of life beyond the haze. He could sense the enemy out there, crouched low, preparing, creeping closer under the cover of the sandstorm. "They're not going to stop until we're dead," he said at last, voice calm but cold. "So we don't give them that satisfaction. Keep your men sharp." Ramirez nodded tightly, his knuckles white around the grip of his rifle, and crawled back toward his position, whispering orders to the others as he moved. The colonel moved along the wreckage of their convoy, his boots sinking into soft sand stained with black soot and crimson streaks. The smell of burned rubber and diesel clung to the air, a stark reminder of the ambush that had started this nightmare, and every shadow in the swirling dust seemed to shift and move like an enemy fighter lurking just out of sight. He stopped beside one of the wounded, a young private propped against a piece of shattered armor plating, his leg bandaged hastily with strips of torn fabric, his face pale and clammy with shock. "Hang in there," the colonel murmured, kneeling to check the bandage, tightening it with swift, sure hands. The boy winced but nodded, trying to straighten his shoulders under the colonel's watchful gaze. "You're going to make it, son," he said firmly, giving him a brief pat on the shoulder before moving on, his rifle slung across his back as he climbed up the rocky embankment to get a better view of the battlefield. The wind howled through the dunes like a living thing, and in the distance faint shapes flickered in and out of view, enemy fighters advancing slowly, hunched low, their rifles at the ready. The colonel's sharp eyes tracked their movements, counting at least a dozen shadows slipping between the rocks, their positions changing with every gust of wind. He crouched low, signaling to his sniper perched behind the wreck of a supply truck, and pointed to the far ridge. The sniper nodded, his gloved hands steady as he adjusted his scope, waiting for a clear shot. The colonel slid back down the embankment, landing silently on his feet, and motioned for Ramirez. "They're coming from the east, moving through the rocks. Tell everyone to shift fire to that flank," he ordered. Ramirez sprinted off to relay the command, and soon the line of battered soldiers repositioned themselves, their rifles braced against the sandbags, their breathing slow and measured as they prepared for the inevitable. The silence broke all at once with a deafening roar of gunfire as the enemy launched their assault, pouring lead into the squad's position with ruthless precision, bullets sparking off the twisted remains of their vehicles as men ducked and returned fire in short, controlled bursts. The colonel's voice rang out over the chaos, calm and commanding, directing fire, repositioning shooters, keeping his men focused as the storm of lead and steel raged around them. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked through the haze and slammed into the embankment, sending a spray of sand and rock into the air, knocking two men off their feet, but they scrambled back up, bleeding and coughing, their rifles still clutched tight. The squad fought like demons, their shots deliberate, their movements disciplined, but the enemy pressed closer, slipping through the gaps in their defenses, firing from every angle. The sound was deafening, rifles cracking, machine guns roaring, grenades exploding, and through it all the colonel moved like a man carved from iron, barking orders, dragging the wounded back behind cover, his own rifle barking out precise bursts that dropped enemies before they could get too close. A soldier to his left cried out, clutching his side as blood seeped through his vest, and another man dove forward, dragging him to safety, their breaths ragged as bullets zipped over their heads. The colonel knelt beside them, yanking open a field dressing with practiced efficiency, pressing it against the wound while keeping one eye on the shifting sand in front of them. "Stay with me, Private," he said firmly, his tone a command rather than comfort, and the injured man gritted his teeth, nodding through the pain. A grenade landed nearby with a dull thud, and instinct took over. The colonel shoved them both flat as it detonated, showering them with sand and shrapnel, the shockwave rattling his teeth. He pushed himself up, brushing dirt from his face, and raised his rifle again, firing at a dark shape darting through the haze. The man dropped, disappearing into the sand, and another took his place, but the colonel's aim was unerring, his shots measured and lethal. The squad was holding, but barely, every man fighting with grim determination as the enemy pressed closer, their movements almost impossible to track through the storm. Ramirez crawled up beside the colonel, sweat streaming down his face despite the cold wind, his eyes wide. "We can't hold this much longer, sir," he shouted over the gunfire. "We're running low on everything." The colonel didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the swirling dust beyond their position, scanning for some sign of hope, some indication that this wouldn't end with all of them lying in shallow graves beneath this cursed desert. He could feel the weight of every life in his command pressing down on him, but there was no room for doubt, no space for fear. "We hold," he said simply, his voice steady, and Ramirez nodded, his expression grim as he crawled back to rally the others. Another wave hit them, this one fiercer than the last, and the squad fought like cornered animals, their rifles spitting fire into the storm as enemies closed in from every direction. The colonel moved like a shadow among them, his presence a steadying force, his every word cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Focus your fire. Watch the flanks. Stay low," he barked, dragging another wounded soldier back behind cover, his hands slick with blood that was not his own. The smell of smoke and death was everywhere, filling his lungs, clinging to his skin, but he pushed it aside, his mind razor-sharp, his instincts honed from years of combat. Every decision was life or death, every second a battle to keep his men alive, and though the odds were stacked impossibly against them, there was not a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He was a soldier, and this was his war, and until his last breath he would not let this squad fall. The sandstorm was their only ally now, a swirling curtain of dust and debris that masked their movements as much as it concealed the enemy's advance, turning the battlefield into a nightmare maze where death lurked in every shifting shadow. The colonel crouched low behind a charred Humvee, his ears ringing from the constant roar of gunfire, his rifle steady in hands that had long ago forgotten what it meant to shake under pressure. Around him, his men fought with grim resolve, their faces streaked with grime and blood, their eyes hard with the knowledge that every bullet they fired might be their last. He could hear Ramirez shouting orders from the far side of their makeshift perimeter, his voice hoarse and ragged but carrying authority, rallying the soldiers to hold their ground. Somewhere in the chaos, a machine gun roared in short, controlled bursts, cutting down advancing shadows, while mortars thumped in the distance, shaking the ground with each impact, showering them with sand and shards of rock. The colonel adjusted his scope, spotting movement at the edge of visibility, a cluster of enemies creeping low along the ridge, rifles ready. He exhaled slowly, lined up the shot, and squeezed the trigger, watching one shadow crumple before shifting to the next, his mind locked into the mechanical rhythm of survival. A sudden crack of gunfire exploded to his right, followed by a strangled scream, and he spun, firing instinctively at a dark figure that had gotten dangerously close to their line. The enemy soldier fell, his weapon skittering across the sand, but the damage had been done. A young private lay clutching his neck, blood pulsing between his fingers as he gasped for air. The colonel didn't hesitate, dropping beside him, pressing a hand over the wound with brutal pressure while shouting for a medic. "Stay with me, son," he barked, his voice a command that cut through the private's panic choking. A medic scrambled over, his hands working fast, slapping gauze and tape over the wound, his face pale but focused. The colonel's eyes flicked back toward the ridge, catching a flicker of movement, and he raised his rifle again, firing controlled bursts until the shapes melted back into the sandstorm. The medic met his eyes briefly, shaking his head with grim finality, but the colonel didn't falter, pushing the body aside and shouting orders to tighten their perimeter. There was no time to mourn, not now, not here. He crawled back toward Ramirez, who was kneeling behind a shattered boulder, his rifle braced as he fired at the approaching enemy. "We're being flanked on both sides. Ramirez shouted over the storm of gunfire. "They're pushing us into the open." The colonel's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the battlefield, the reality of their situation becoming clearer with each passing second. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of ammunition, but retreat wasn't an option. There was nowhere to run. "Hold the line," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We fall back and they'll cut us to pieces. We stand here, we make them pay for every inch." Ramirez nodded grimly, relaying the order to the others as the colonel climbed to a higher vantage point, his boots slipping slightly on loose sand. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked out of the storm, slamming into the remains of a supply truck with a deafening explosion that sent a shockwave rippling through their position, knocking men to the ground. The colonel ducked instinctively, shielding his face from flying debris, his ears ringing from the blast. When the dust cleared, the truck was nothing but twisted metal and flames, and two men lay motionless nearby. Without hesitation he sprinted through the open, crouched low, dragging one soldier by the vest while shouting for cover fire. Bullets kicked up sand at his heels, but he moved with the precision of a man who'd done this 100 times, dragging the wounded back behind the line before rushing back for the second body. This one was gone, eyes staring blankly into the storm, but the colonel grabbed his dog tags and pocketed them, a silent promise to bring them home. He dove behind cover again, breathing hard, sweat stinging his eyes, but his expression remained cold, focused. The enemy pressed harder, their movements growing bolder as they closed the distance, their rifles spitting fire as they advanced through the storm. The squad responded with controlled bursts, conserving ammo as much as they could, but their magazines were running dry and desperation was setting in. "We're almost out, sir," Ramirez shouted, crawling over with a half-empty ammo box. "This is it. Once this is gone, we're down to sidearms." The colonel's mind raced, calculating their dwindling chances, but his face betrayed nothing. He grabbed a fresh magazine, slamming it into his rifle with practiced efficiency, and met Ramirez's frantic gaze with calm steel. "Then make every shot count," he said, his voice low but firm. "We hold until the last man." Ramirez swallowed hard, nodding, and crawled back to his position, shouting encouragement to the others. The colonel leaned out from cover, firing in short, precise bursts, each shot finding its mark as he moved from target to target with machine-like precision. Years of combat had sharpened him into something more than a soldier. He was a predator, cold and efficient, and every enemy who dared to get close paid the price. But even predators could be overwhelmed, and he knew they were nearing their breaking point. A grenade detonated nearby, sending a cloud of sand and shrapnel into the air, and the colonel felt a sharp sting in his leg as a fragment tore through his pants, but he pushed the pain aside, gritting his teeth as he kept firing. His squad needed him steady and he refused to falter. As the firefight raged, he noticed something strange, a sudden lull in enemy fire, a pause that didn't feel like a retreat but something else entirely. He froze, signaling his men to hold fire, scanning the haze for movement. The storm swirled around them, visibility down to almost nothing, but he could feel the tension in the air, the sense that they were being watched, hunted. A faint sound cut through the howling wind, a low, mechanical hum that didn't belong on this battlefield. The colonel's brow furrowed as he strained to hear it over the pounding of his own heart. It was faint at first, almost lost in the roar of the storm, but growing louder with each passing second. "Hold your fire," he ordered quietly, his voice sharp enough to carry. The squad obeyed, their rifles lowered slightly as they exchanged confused glances. The hum deepened into a growl, a throaty roar that sent vibrations through the ground, and the colonel's eyes widened as realization dawned. "Aircraft," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Ramirez glanced at him, confusion etched on his dirt-streaked face. "What?" The colonel didn't answer, his eyes scanning the sky as the sound grew louder, the storm around them whipping into a frenzy. "Get down," he shouted suddenly, shoving Ramirez flat just as a thunderous roar split the air, and a dark shape burst through the swirling dust above them, its wings wide, its engine screaming. The men froze, their eyes wide with disbelief as the unmistakable silhouette of an A-10 Warthog cut through the chaos, banking low over their position like a predator swooping in for the kill. The colonel felt a surge of adrenaline, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Help had come after all. The roar of the A-10's twin engines thundered across the desert like a storm unleashed from the heavens, its massive frame cutting through the swirling sand as it swooped low over their position, a steel beast of salvation. The soldiers who moments ago had been pressed to the ground in desperation now stared upward in awe, hope flickering in their eyes for the first time since the ambush began. The colonel didn't waste a second, He seized the radio, slapping the cracked transmitter against his mouth, hoping for a signal. Hammer 2-1, this is Colonel Hayes, we are pinned at grid Alpha 7, friendly position marked with smoke, danger close fire mission, repeat, danger close, East Ridge. His voice was sharp, commanding, his words cutting through the chaos like a blade. Static hissed in reply, then a calm voice came through, copy Colonel. We see you. Stand by for fire. Support. Stay down. The colonel dropped the useless radio back to the ground and grabbed a smoke grenade, yanking the pin before hurling it into the open. The canister hissed and sputtered, spewing bright orange smoke that mixed with the storm, marking their desperate position. A second later, the A-10 banked sharply, angling its nose toward the ridge where enemy fighters had been advancing. The iconic whine of its Ju-8 Avenger cannon spun up, a deep, mechanical growl that built into a terrifying roar, and then came the sound that every soldier on the battlefield knew. Boing! The cannon unleashed a stream of 30mm rounds with devastating precision, each round striking like a thunderbolt, tearing through rocks, vehicles, and bodies alike, turning the eastern ridge into a storm of fire and steel. The ground shook with the sheer ferocity of the strike, debris flying in all directions as enemy fighters were ripped apart, their screams swallowed by the unrelenting roar of the gun. The colonel pressed himself flat to the ground, sand and fragments raining down on his back, his teeth gritted against the concussive force. The A-10 swept past, its engines screaming before banking hard to line up for another run. Reload, hold your fire, wait for them to regroup. Hayes shouted, his voice steady despite the chaos, and his men obeyed, ducking low, their faces wide-eyed at the carnage they had just witnessed. The enemy's advance faltered, their confident push suddenly shattered under the terrifying precision of air power. Fighters scrambled for cover, some retreating deeper into the storm, others firing blindly into the sky, their rounds bouncing harmlessly off the A-10's thick armor. The aircraft swung around again, coming in low and slow, and once more that brutal roar filled the air as the Avenger cannon spat death, its rounds carving through enemy vehicles, shredding the makeshift barricades they'd erected. A truck loaded with ammunition exploded in a massive fireball, the shockwave rattling teeth and sending a plume of black smoke high into the storm. The soldiers cheered instinctively, a ragged, desperate sound that carried through the battlefield like a rallying cry. The colonel raised his head just enough to see the destruction unfold, his sharp eyes scanning for movement. Keep your heads down, he barked, though even he couldn't keep the edge of relief from his voice. The battle had shifted in an instant. The relentless, suffocating pressure of being hunted was gone, replaced by the thunder of their savior in the sky. The A-10's pilot worked with surgical precision, strafing enemy positions with bursts of cannon fire, each pass sending another wave of chaos through their ranks. Mortars that had been pounding their position moments before fell silent as enemy crews abandoned their weapons, scattering like ants under a magnifying glass. The colonel's men moved with renewed energy, reloading weapons, tending to the wounded and re-establishing their defensive perimeter. Hayes crawled over to Ramirez, who was crouched behind a smoking Humvee, reloading his rifle. We've got breathing room, Hayes said, his voice steady but low. Get the wounded consolidated here now. We might have a window to evac. Ramirez nodded, his face streaked with grime but his eyes burning with determination. He signaled two men nearby, and they began dragging the wounded to a makeshift casualty collection point behind the wrecked convoy. Overhead, the A-10 made another pass, this time unleashing a pair of rockets that streaked through the storm, slamming into a cluster of enemy fighters regrouping on the western ridge. The explosion was deafening, the shockwave rattling the ground, and once again the enemy line broke. Hayes keyed his radio again, his voice sharp. Hammer 2-1, excellent effect on target, continue suppression, we are preparing to extract, over. The pilot's calm voice returned, copy Colonel, we'll keep their heads down. Dust off inbound in 10 mics. Relief surged through Hayes' chest at those words, helicopters were coming. They weren't going to die here, not today. But the fight wasn't over yet. Ramirez. Hayes barked, motioning for him to crawl over. We hold here until the birds arrive. Ammo status. Ramirez grimaced, pulling a magazine from his vest. Half a mag each, maybe less. We're dry on grenades. The heavy's down. Hayes' expression hardened, but he nodded. Doesn't matter. We hold. He turned to the rest of the squad, his voice cutting through the chaos. Listen up. Air support's on station, evac inbound in 10 minutes. We hold this ground until those birds get here or we die here. There's no retreat. No surrender. You hear me? A chorus of yes, sir, rose from the battered men, their voices hoarse but filled with grit. The A-10 swept low again, strafing the edges of their perimeter, buying them precious time. Hayes moved like a man possessed, repositioning soldiers, reinforcing weak points in their defense, his mind calculating every possible angle of attack. The enemy wasn't gone. He could see their silhouettes moving in the distance, regrouping, preparing to make one last push to wipe them out before reinforcements arrived. He glanced up at the sky where the A-10 banked against the storm, a dark angel of war circling overhead. "Stay with us," he muttered under his breath as if the pilot could hear him. The lull didn't last long. A sudden burst of gunfire from the north signaled the start of another wave, enemy fighters charging through the storm, desperate and reckless. Hayes spun, raising his rifle and opened fire, cutting down the first man who appeared through the haze. His squad followed suit, unleashing what little ammunition they had left, every shot deliberate, every trigger pull a fight for survival. The A-10 roared back into the fray, its cannon shredding the attackers, ripping up the ground in front of them, forcing them to scatter. The noise was deafening, the battlefield shaking with each pass, but Hayes and his men used the cover fire to hold their line, firing, reloading, and shouting encouragement to one another over the roar. A rocket screamed past, slamming into the wreckage near their position, the blast throwing Hayes backward, his ears ringing as he hit the ground hard. He rolled to his stomach, coughing, sand in his mouth, but he forced himself back up, gripping his rifle tightly. Around him, men scrambled to their feet, shaken but alive, and he barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Hold. Keep firing. Keep them back." His leg throbbed from the earlier shrapnel wound, but he ignored it, focusing only on the fight. The A-10 swooped low once more, its cannon roaring, sending another line of enemy fighters sprawling in pieces across the sand. Through the haze, Hayes spotted something. A glint of metal, the faint outline of a helicopter silhouette in the distance, growing larger with each second. His heart surged. "Dust off inbound," he shouted, pointing to the sky. The squad erupted in cheers even as they fired their last rounds, holding the enemy at bay. The helicopters were coming, salvation thundering toward them through the storm. But between them and safety, the enemy regrouped for one final assault, their desperation pushing them into a frenzy. Hayes slammed a fresh mag into his rifle, gritting his teeth. "One more push," he muttered to himself, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "One more push and we're out of here." The storm screamed around them like a living thing. As the thundering rotors of the approaching helicopters grew louder, their deep, rhythmic beat cutting through the chaos like a promise of salvation. Yet that promise was distant, fragile, as the enemy surged forward with renewed fury, determined to crush the battered squad before extraction could arrive. The colonel crouched behind a chunk of twisted steel, rifle braced against his shoulder, scanning the swirling haze for movement. The sand stung his face, whipped by fierce winds, and every breath tasted of grit and gunpowder. "Incoming!" Ramirez shouted, pointing toward the north ridge where shadows shifted in the storm, and Hayes immediately barked orders, his voice sharp, unwavering. "Focus fire north. Pour it on." The squad obeyed, rifles cracking in unison, sending bursts of fire into the approaching shapes, their last magazines spent with ruthless precision. Bullets sparked against rock and ricocheted into the sand, but the enemy pressed forward relentlessly, their figures ghostly and blurred through the swirling dust, firing as they charged. The colonel leaned out, squeezed off 3 quick shots, and watched 2 of the attackers drop before he ducked back behind cover, a round sparking off the steel just inches from his head. "Ammo check." Hayes barked over the roar of gunfire, and Ramirez scrambled closer, his face pale beneath the grime. "2 mags left, sir, that's it," Ramirez said grimly, his hands trembling slightly as he slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle. Hayes's expression hardened, but he gave a single nod. "Make it count," he said flatly. The A-10 roared overhead again, its cannon spinning up with a metallic whine before unleashing another stream of death into the enemy's path, ripping apart the sand and rock with precise, devastating fire. Bodies were flung into the air, their screams lost in the roar, but still more came, desperate fighters rushing through the chaos, driven by either courage or madness. The squad fired steadily, their discipline unbroken even as their numbers dwindled, but every man knew they were hanging by a thread. "Contact left," a soldier screamed, and Hayes spun to see enemy fighters flanking them through the haze. He pivoted, firing in controlled bursts, dropping 2 before a third broke through, charging with a raised rifle. Hayes didn't hesitate. He surged forward, meeting the attacker head-on, slamming the butt of his rifle into the man's jaw before firing point blank. The body crumpled and Hayes ducked back behind cover, his chest heaving, adrenaline surging through his veins. "Keep the perimeter tight," he shouted, scanning for Ramirez. The corporal was crouched behind a sandbag wall, firing in short, precise bursts, his face set in grim determination. Another explosion rattled the ground, and Hayes felt the sting of shrapnel slice across his arm, but he ignored the pain, focused only on the fight. Above the chaos, the thundering rotors of the helicopters grew louder, closer, and Hayes risked a glance skyward. Through the dust and smoke, he saw them, two UH-60 Black Hawks, their silhouettes cutting through the haze like dark angels, their miniguns already spinning. "Dust off is here," Hayes bellowed, his voice carrying over the storm. The squad erupted in cheers even as they fired their last rounds, hope flaring bright in their exhausted eyes. The lead Black Hawk swooped low, its side gunners unleashing a torrent of fire that shredded enemy fighters in seconds, clearing a swath of ground for landing. The other helicopter banked to cover their flank, its guns roaring as tracers lit up the battlefield. Hayes seized the moment. "Go, go, go!" he roared, signaling Ramirez to start moving the wounded. Soldiers scrambled, dragging their injured comrades toward the landing zone, their boots slipping in the loose sand, their breaths ragged with exhaustion. Hayes moved like a man possessed, covering his men with precise, lethal fire as they began their retreat. "Move! Keep moving!" he shouted, his rifle barking with every step, each shot deliberate. Bullets whipped past him, rounds kicking up sand near his boots, but he didn't falter, his focus absolute. He grabbed a wounded soldier under the arms, hauling him up and dragging him toward the waiting helicopter while firing one-handed at a figure rushing through the haze. The man dropped, and Hayes shoved the injured soldier into the arms of a medic waiting at the Black Hawk's side before spinning to lay down more cover fire. The helicopter's gunner provided devastating support, mowing down attackers as they tried to close the gap, buying the squad precious seconds to load their wounded. Ramirez sprinted up beside him, breathing hard, his rifle empty. "I'm dry, sir," he shouted, fumbling for his sidearm. Hayes tossed him one of his own magazines, slamming another into his rifle. "We're almost there," Hayes barked. The last of the wounded were loaded, their screams of pain drowned out by the roar of engines and gunfire. Hayes motioned for the remaining men to fall back, firing in controlled bursts as they retreated toward the Black Hawk. The enemy, sensing their prey slipping away, surged forward in a final desperate push, gunfire crackling from all directions. Hayes spun, dropped two attackers with precise shots, then crouched behind a rock outcropping, providing cover for Ramirez and two others as they sprinted for the helicopter. The A-10 swooped low once more, its cannon roaring with fury, carving a path of destruction through the advancing fighters, buying Hayes a moment of breathing room. He took it without hesitation, sprinting toward the helicopter, his boots pounding the sand, his rifle still spitting fire at the shadows that pursued him. Bullets zipped past, one grazing his shoulder, but he didn't slow. Ramirez leaned out of the Black Hawk, shouting, "Come on, sir!" Hayes dove the last few feet, hands grabbing the edge of the helicopter's door as Ramirez hauled him in. He landed hard inside, rolling to a crouch, his rifle still raised as he shouted, "Lift! Lift now!" The pilot didn't need telling twice. The Black Hawk's engines roared, and the bird began to rise, sand whipping around in a furious cyclone as the remaining squad members fired from the doors, covering their escape. As the helicopter climbed higher, Hayes peered down at the battlefield below, his eyes scanning the devastation. The once barren desert was now a charred wasteland littered with burning vehicles and shattered bodies, the enemy retreating under the unrelenting fire from the A-10 still circling like a hawk. The second Black Hawk peeled away, its guns blazing, ensuring no pursuit could follow. Hayes finally allowed himself to slump back against the doorframe, his body aching from exhaustion and injury, but his mind sharp, already counting heads, tallying survivors. Ramirez slid down beside him, panting heavily, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. "We made it," Ramirez said, disbelief in his voice. Hayes gave a single nod, his expression grim. "Some of us," he replied quietly, his gaze sweeping the helicopter interior where medics worked frantically over the wounded. The Black Hawk banked hard, carrying them away from the cursed patch of desert that had nearly become their grave. The sound of gunfire faded behind them, replaced by the steady thrum of rotor blades and the sharp voices of medics shouting instructions. Hayes reached into his vest pocket, pulling out a handful of dog tags collected from the fallen. He closed his fist around them, his jaw tightening. Victory was a bitter taste in his mouth, tinged with loss, but survival was survival, and his men would live to fight another day. Ramirez glanced at him, his eyes tired but full of respect. "We couldn't have held without you, sir." Hayes shook his head, glancing out the open door where the A-10 circled one last time before banking away. "We didn't hold because of me," Hayes said quietly, his voice low and firm. "We held because we refused to break." The Black Hawk's engines roared as it sped low across the endless desert, the air inside thick with the stench of blood, gunpowder, and sweat. Every seat and inch of floor space was taken up by exhausted soldiers and wounded comrades, medics working frantically as the rotors thumped overhead like a relentless heartbeat. Hayes sat on the floor near the open door, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the desolate horizon below. His body ached with every breath, but his mind refused to relax. He had been in this situation too many times, and he knew danger didn't end just because they were airborne. Ramirez sat slumped against the wall opposite him, face pale, holding a pressure dressing on a wounded soldier's chest while murmuring encouragement through clenched teeth. "Stay with me, brother," Ramirez whispered as the medic knelt beside him, quickly checking the man's pulse before barking for more bandages. The soldier's breathing was ragged, blood soaking through the dressing, but his eyes flickered with determination. Hayes tore his gaze away, focusing back outside, his heart pounding as adrenaline still surged through his veins, unwilling to let him rest. The second Black Hawk flew in tight formation on their flank, its door gunners scanning the terrain below for signs of pursuit, but the desert stretched out like an ocean of shifting dust and stone, silent save for the distant echoes of battle they'd left behind. The A-10 was gone now, its mission complete, but Hayes could almost hear its distinctive roar echoing in his ears, a sound that would forever be burned into his memory as the moment their hopeless fight turned. He glanced toward the cockpit, where the pilot's voice crackled over the radio, coordinating their path back to the forward operating base. "Dust off 1 inbound, 20 minutes out," the pilot said calmly, but Hayes knew 20 minutes could feel like a lifetime in this part of the world. The enemy had eyes everywhere, and the possibility of an ambush lingered like a shadow over every second of their flight. Hayes turned his attention back to his men, counting heads, checking gear, silently cataloging wounds and losses. Every man was coated in grime, uniforms torn and stained with blood, faces lined with exhaustion, but their eyes burned with the hard light of survival. These weren't rookies, they were hardened soldiers, and yet even they looked shaken by the hell they'd just endured. Ramirez caught Hayes's eye and gave him a faint nod, a silent reassurance that he was holding together despite the chaos. Hayes nodded back, then leaned over to check the wounded soldier Ramirez was tending. The man's breathing was shallow, lips pale, but his eyes met Hayes's for a moment. Hayes gripped his shoulder firmly, his voice low but steady. "You're going to make it, soldier. Just hold on." The man blinked in response, and Hayes gave his shoulder one more reassuring squeeze before turning back to scan the cabin. The medics moved with controlled urgency, their hands stained red as they worked to stabilize injuries. Hayes watched them in silence, his thoughts heavy, each dog tag in his pocket feeling like a stone. He could still hear the screams, the chaos, the roar of the A-10's cannon. He had led men through countless battles, but this one had felt different. More desperate, more hopeless. They had been written off as dead before that plane arrived, and Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that their survival had come down to pure luck, a twist of fate rather than any brilliance on his part. He looked at Ramirez again, at the way the young soldier refused to stop talking to the man he was helping, his voice calm and steady despite the blood soaking his hands. That wasn't luck. That was grit, loyalty, and courage. Hayes knew his men deserved credit for holding that ground as much as the air support that had saved them. The helicopters banked hard, and Hayes grabbed the doorframe for support, peering out at the rugged terrain below. The desert gave way to rocky outcroppings and jagged ridges, the landscape harsh and unforgiving, every shadow a potential threat. His eyes scanned for movement, for the telltale glint of enemy weaponry, but saw only the endless expanse of barren land. Still he couldn't relax. He adjusted the sling on his rifle, ready for whatever might come, and his mind wandered briefly to the colonel's words back at the outpost, "No help is coming." Hayes could still see the look on the man's face, the grim certainty, the way he had prepared himself to die out there. And yet help had come, roaring out of the dust like an avenging angel, turning the tide in seconds. Hayes didn't believe in miracles, but he'd never forget that moment as long as he lived. A sudden cough of static filled the radio, and Hayes glanced toward the cockpit as the pilot exchanged words with the forward operating base. "Roger, inbound with multiple wounded, requesting immediate medevac on arrival," the pilot said, his voice calm and professional. Hayes shifted his gaze back to his men, silently counting again. They had lost 5. The number hit him like a weight on his chest, but there was no time to grieve, not yet. He focused instead on the living, checking for signs of shock, adjusting bandages, offering quiet words of reassurance where he could. Ramirez finally leaned back against the wall, exhaustion written all over him, but his eyes were steady. "He's stable for now," Ramirez said, nodding toward the soldier at his side. Hayes gave him a brief nod of approval, pride flickering in his chest. "Good work," he said simply. The helicopters finally crested a ridge, and the sprawling base came into view, its perimeter lit by floodlights, vehicles moving in tight formation as they prepared to receive the battered squad. Hayes felt a strange mix of relief and tension tighten in his gut. The fight was over, but the war was far from done. He could already see medics rushing to the landing zone, stretchers ready, the hum of organized chaos awaiting them. The pilots brought the Black Hawks in low, rotors kicking up dust as they descended toward the pad. Hayes stood, gripping the handhold by the door, his body swaying with the motion as the ground rose to meet them. "Get ready," he called, his voice carrying over the roar of the engines. The soldiers stirred, adjusting their gear, tightening their grips on weapons, even the wounded bracing themselves as the bird touched down with a jolt. The doors swung open and medics surged forward, hands reaching for the injured, barking instructions as they began unloading the most critical casualties first. Hayes jumped out, boots hitting the tarmac hard, and immediately began coordinating with the ground crew, pointing out which soldiers needed urgent attention. The night air was cooler here, but it carried the same scent of fuel and sweat, the ever-present reminder that this was a war zone. Ramirez followed close behind, helping guide stretchers as the medics whisked away the wounded. Hayes moved with them, making sure every soldier was accounted for, his sharp eyes missing nothing even as fatigue gnawed at his limbs. When the last of his men was safely offloaded, Hayes finally allowed himself to take a step back, his rifle hanging loosely from its sling, his shoulders sagging slightly as the adrenaline began to ebb. He looked around the landing zone, watching as the helicopters lifted off again, heading back into the dark sky like shadows. The medics worked quickly under the harsh floodlights, triaging injuries with practiced precision, their voices sharp and steady. Hayes turned away from the chaos, walking slowly toward the edge of the pad, and stared out at the desert beyond the base's walls. The sound of the A-10's cannon still echoed in his memory, a grim reminder of how close they had come to dying out there. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face, and for the first time since the firefight began, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything they'd survived. The war was far from over, but tonight they had lived. The forward operating base buzzed with restless energy, the floodlights casting harsh white beams across the busy compound as soldiers hustled between vehicles, medical tents, and fortified positions. Hayes stood on the edge of the landing pad, his boots still dusted with sand from the desert battlefield, watching as the medics wheeled his wounded men toward the triage area. The roar of departing helicopters echoed overhead, fading into the night as the chaos of evacuation gave way to the sharp efficiency of base operations. The air smelled of jet fuel, antiseptic, and sweat, a grim cocktail Hayes knew all too well. He turned his gaze to Ramirez, who stood nearby, shoulders squared despite the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Ramirez's rifle hung at his side, his uniform torn and stained, but his eyes were alert, scanning the base as though expecting the enemy to materialize at any moment. "Go get checked out," Hayes said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command but softened by respect. Ramirez shook his head stubbornly, wiping grit from his brow. "I'm fine, sir. I'll wait until the others are stable." Hayes studied him for a moment, then gave a single nod. That loyalty, that refusal to rest until his brothers in arms were safe, was why Ramirez had earned Hayes's trust time and again. Inside the medical tent, the scene was controlled chaos. Doctors and medics worked swiftly over stretchers, cutting away uniforms, applying tourniquets, stitching wounds, and setting 4 lines with a cold efficiency born of necessity. Hayes moved through the tent, his presence silent but commanding, his eyes locking on each of his men in turn. The wounded soldier Ramirez had carried was still alive, hooked up to oxygen, his chest rising and falling in shallow but steady breaths. Hayes crouched beside him briefly, gripping his hand firmly. The soldier's eyes fluttered open for a moment, and Hayes offered him a faint nod. "You did good out there," Hayes murmured, his voice low but strong. The man blinked weakly in acknowledgement before the medic ushered Hayes aside to continue their work. Hayes rose, scanning the room, counting heads again, every number burned into his memory. They had lost 5. 5 good men who would never leave that cursed stretch of desert. The weight of it pressed against his chest, heavy and unrelenting, but Hayes didn't let it show. A commander couldn't afford to break. As he stepped out of the tent, a young lieutenant approached, saluting sharply. "Sir, Colonel Mason requests your presence in the command center for debriefing." Hayes returned the salute and gave Ramirez a glance. "Stay with the men," he ordered. Ramirez nodded without hesitation, his rifle shifting across his shoulder as he moved to stand guard near the medical tent. Hayes turned toward the heart of the base, his boots striking the packed earth with a steady rhythm as he made his way toward the reinforced building that served as their operations hub. The guards outside snapped to attention as he passed, their eyes flicking briefly to the dried blood on his sleeves and the exhaustion in his posture, but they said nothing. Inside, the command center was lit with a sterile glow, screens displaying live drone feeds of the surrounding terrain, radio chatter filling the air. Colonel Mason stood at the far end of the room, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and an expression carved from stone. Hayes stopped in front of him, snapping a sharp salute. Mason returned it, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Hayes. "Report," Mason said simply. Hayes recited the events in a clipped, precise tone, recounting every moment of the ambush, every maneuver, every casualty. Mason listened in silence, his jaw tightening when Hayes reached the part about being told no reinforcements were available. Hayes left no detail out, his words carrying the blunt truth of what had happened. When he finished, Mason exhaled slowly, resting both hands on the table in front of him. "You were outnumbered 5-1, Mason said after a long pause. "You should all be dead." Hayes met his gaze without flinching. "We held as long as we could," Hayes said evenly. "And when the A-10 arrived, we made every second count." Mason's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained hard. "That pilot disobeyed a direct order," Mason said. "He was told to divert to another sector." Hayes's jaw tightened. "Then he saved lives by disobeying," Hayes replied. Mason studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "I'll see he's commended. As for you and your men, you did more than anyone had a right to expect. The intel you recovered from that site will change the course of this campaign." Hayes remained silent, his mind flashing back to the blood-soaked battlefield, the faces of the men they'd lost. Victory felt hollow. Mason's voice broke through his thoughts. "You'll rest, Hayes. That's an order. I need you ready for the next op, and if I know you, you won't stop moving unless someone tells you to." Hayes gave a curt nod. "Understood, sir." Mason leaned back slightly, his expression softening for the first time. "You did well, son. Get cleaned up. Get some food. Your men need to see you standing." Hayes saluted again, then turned to leave, his boots echoing through the command center as he stepped back into the cool night air. The base was quieter now, though activity still hummed around the perimeter. The enemy had been dealt a devastating blow, but Hayes knew they'd regroup. They always did. He walked back toward the barracks, pausing near the medical tent where Ramirez still stood guard. The younger man looked up, his expression a mixture of fatigue and relief. "How's the colonel?" Ramirez asked. "Satisfied," Hayes replied. Ramirez allowed himself a small smile, then returned to his watchful stance. Inside the barracks, Hayes finally removed his gear, setting his rifle carefully on the rack by his bunk. His hands trembled slightly as he stripped off his armor, the weight of the day catching up with him all at once. His uniform was stiff with sweat and dust, his body aching from bruises and shrapnel wounds, but he ignored the pain, forcing himself through the motions. He sat on the edge of the bunk, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor as memories of the battle flickered through his mind like a film reel. The roar of the A-10, the storm of gunfire, the screams. He pulled the dog tags from his pocket, letting them dangle from his fingers, the metal clinking softly in the quiet room. Each one represented a man he'd sworn to bring home alive, and each one was a weight on his soul. He closed his fist around them, bowing his head for a long moment before finally slipping them into a pouch on his vest. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford yet, not with so many wounded still fighting for their lives, but he forced himself to lie back for a moment, staring up at the ceiling. The barracks smelled of dust and gun oil, a familiar scent that should have been comforting, but Hayes felt only the gnawing restlessness of a soldier who knew the fight was far from over. Outside, the rumble of armored vehicles and the distant chatter of guards patrolling the perimeter was a constant reminder of their reality. Hayes closed his eyes briefly, but every time he tried to let go, he saw flashes of the battle, the sandstorm swirling like a living thing, the enemy charging through the haze and the A-10 swooping in like a wrathful ghost. He opened his eyes again, sitting up slowly. There would be no real rest tonight. He pulled on a clean shirt, laced his boots and stepped back out into the cool desert air, his senses sharpening as he headed for the perimeter. The desert night was quiet but restless, a stillness that never truly felt safe. The base perimeter hummed with low conversations, the crunch of boots on gravel, and the occasional metallic clink of weapons being checked and rechecked. Hayes moved along the edge of the compound, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness beyond the floodlights. The sand stretched out in every direction, an unforgiving wasteland that hid more threats than any drone feed could ever reveal. He'd traded his rifle for a sidearm tonight, but his posture remained rigid, alert, as though he expected the enemy to erupt from the shadows at any moment. A light breeze carried with it the scent of fuel and dust, and somewhere nearby, a generator hummed steadily. The war never truly slept, and neither did Hayes. As he approached the main gate, a soldier saluted sharply. Hayes returned it without breaking stride, his mind elsewhere, already cataloging strategies, weaknesses, and the inevitable retaliation their enemy would plan after such a crushing defeat. He reached the edge of the landing pad and stopped, staring out at the faint lights in the distance where the battlefield lay, now silent but still fresh in his memory. Behind him, footsteps approached. Hayes turned slightly as Ramirez walked up, his shoulders squared despite the exhaustion in his gait. His uniform was clean now, but the shadows under his eyes betrayed a man who had seen too much in one day. "Couldn't sleep either?" Hayes asked quietly. Ramirez shook his head, leaning against a stack of crates. "Not after that," he replied. His voice was calm but heavy. Hayes studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the distant desert. "You held the line out there," Hayes said. "All of you did." Ramirez let out a humorless laugh. "Barely," he muttered. Hayes didn't smile. "Barely is still alive. And alive means we get another shot at them." Ramirez's eyes hardened, and he gave a slow nod. Hayes clapped him on the shoulder. "Get some rest, Ramirez. You're no good to me dead on your feet." Ramirez hesitated, then saluted and walked back toward the barracks, his figure fading into the glow of the floodlights. Hayes lingered at the pad, lost in thought, until the distant roar of engines pulled him from his reverie. He looked up to see a lone A-10 cutting across the night sky, its silhouette stark against the stars as it circled the base. The sound of its engines stirred something deep in Hayes's chest, gratitude, respect, and a lingering disbelief that they were still breathing because of that machine and the pilot guiding it. The jet banked low, then vanished beyond the horizon, leaving only silence in its wake. Hayes turned and made his way toward the hangar where aircraft were maintained, curiosity gnawing at him. He wanted to meet the person who had changed the course of their fate with a single defiant choice. The hangar was dimly lit, the smell of oil and hydraulic fluid heavy in the air. Mechanics moved about quietly, tending to various aircraft with practiced efficiency. At the far end, under a glaring work light, sat the A-10, its armored fuselage still streaked with dust and soot from the battle. Its shark-toothed nose art looked like it was snarling even at rest, and Hayes felt a strange surge of respect for the ugly, deadly machine. A mechanic glanced up as Hayes approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "Looking for the pilot?" the man asked, his voice carrying a note of amusement. Hayes nodded. "Hangar office," the mechanic said, jerking his thumb toward a small side room. Hayes thanked him and walked over, pushing open the door. Inside, a young woman sat at a desk, still in her flight suit, her helmet resting beside her. She looked up as Hayes entered, her eyes sharp and steady despite the dark circles beneath them. "Captain Hayes," she said, her voice even. He paused, surprised she knew his name, then nodded. "Ma'am," he said simply. She smirked faintly. "I figured you'd come looking." Hayes stepped closer, studying her for a moment. "You disobeyed orders," he said. Her smirk widened slightly. "Yeah, I did." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "I was redirected to Sector 9, but something didn't sit right. Intel said your team was surrounded, and Command said there was no way to reach you in time." I disagreed. Her tone was casual, but Hayes could hear the steel beneath it. "You saved my men," Hayes said. She shrugged lightly. "It was the right call. You held that line long enough for me to get there. Not many squads would have lasted that long." Hayes studied her a moment longer, then extended his hand. "I owe you," he said firmly. She looked at his hand, then shook it, her grip strong. "Just doing my job," she replied. Hayes left the hangar with a renewed sense of purpose. The war was far from over, but the battle had given him and his squad more than just survival. It had reminded them that courage still existed in defiance of orders, that victory wasn't always about strategy but about refusing to break even when death was certain. Back at the barracks, he found Ramirez sitting on the steps outside, polishing his rifle under the dim light of a nearby lamp. Hayes sat beside him, the silence between them comfortable, broken only by the distant hum of the bass. After a moment Ramirez spoke softly. "I thought we were dead out there," he admitted. Hayes glanced at him, his expression calm but serious. "So did I," he said honestly. Ramirez looked down at his rifle. "Feels like we cheated death." Hayes shook his head. "We didn't cheat death. We earned life. Every shot we fired, every second we held our ground, that's why we're here. That's why those men didn't die for nothing." Ramirez nodded slowly, his jaw tightening with quiet determination. Hours passed and the base began to settle into a fragile calm. The wounded were stable, and those who had died were laid to rest in silence, their bodies draped in flags, their sacrifice honored with somber ceremony. Hayes stood at attention with his men as the chaplain spoke, the words carried away by the desert wind. When the salute rang out, sharp and final, Hayes felt the weight of command settle heavier on his shoulders. He had led his men into hell, and though some had not come back, most had. That mattered. That was his duty and he had fulfilled it. After the ceremony, Hayes dismissed his men, watching as they dispersed quietly, each of them carrying their own ghosts from that day. Later, in the command center, Mason gathered the leadership team for a briefing. Drone footage showed enemy forces retreating, their strength crippled by the devastating attack. Hayes sat at the table, silent but attentive as strategies for the next mission were laid out. "They're reeling," Mason said, pointing at the map. "We've got a window to hit them hard before they regroup." Hayes nodded, his mind already working through scenarios. The squad was battered, but they would fight again. That was what soldiers did. When the meeting ended, Mason stopped Hayes at the door. "I read your report. You kept those men alive when anyone else would have folded." Hayes met his gaze steadily. "They kept each other alive," Hayes corrected. Mason smiled faintly. "Good answer." That night, Hayes walked the perimeter one last time, the desert stretching endlessly under the moonlight. The battlefield they'd escaped was invisible from here, but he could feel it, like an echo in his bones. He thought of the pilot, of the way the A-10 had ripped through the storm like divine wrath, and of his men who had fought like lions despite the odds. War was cruel, but moments like that proved why they fought, to stand, to endure, to refuse defeat. Hayes took a slow breath, then turned back toward the base. There would be another battle, another mission, another desperate stand, but he would face it the same way he had faced every fight before. Unbroken. The end.